fall in the 5th century AD. The idea of the end of a sophisticated society like the Roman Empire still haunts us. Rome, for 1,200 years, it was progressing, evolving to an ever richer, ever more material, bountiful society, suddenly collapsed in the 5th century AD. Typically, we use the word 476 AD as a date. This haunted Edward Gibbon, and his monumental work, The Decline and Fall of Rome, is sort of the basis for declinist studies. And today, as we look at the United States, we ask ourselves, are we Britain after World War II? Are we the Spanish Empire in the 17th century? Are we the Ottomans in the 19th century? But behind all of these parallels and comparisons looms, are we Rome? In fact, there are books published called Are We Rome? And still today, 2,000 years after the fact, we don't know why Roman civilization that was trans-Mediterranean collapsed at the end of the 5th century AD. Now, to find the answer, we have to keep a few general parameters in mind. Number one, the inquiry is made more difficult because it didn't quite collapse in the East. There was a Byzantine Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire had separated under the reigns of Diocletian and Constantine. And from 315, 320 AD on, a Greek-speaking, sophisticated culture that had been the bulwark of the Roman Empire in the East became autonomous, so to speak. And this society lasted until 1453, when Constantinople fell to the Turks. So whatever the problem was in the West, it was not quite the same in the East. Maybe they had more defensible borders, maybe they had a better navy, maybe Constantinople was located in a place Rome wasn't, maybe the population density across the Hellespont of Eastern European tribes was not as quite as great as it was the population pressure pressing on Rome. We don't know the answer, but we have to keep that in mind, that Roman civilization survived for another 1,000 years in the East. The other thing we have to keep in mind is whatever cause that we can ascertain, it won't be unique. If it was a revolution or too much civil strife, we say, oh my God, 193 they had 6 emperors, 69 AD they had 4. The Severian dynasty was plagued by coups, assassinations, civil war, civil strife. That wasn't new. There were always volcanic eruptions. There were always barbarians. They'd come in the 3rd century BC across the Rhine and Danube into the Italian peninsula. So what was it about the 5th century AD that made it not be able to endure these constant stimuli, these constant assaults on Roman civilization that they had weathered in the past? That's a second warning sign that we have to be careful about. And the third is that there are a number of scholars, we call them today scholars of late antiquity, who don't quite believe Rome fell. And they have a good argument in one sense, and that is that if you were to go into 16th century Florence, people would be speaking a language, Italian, that's very similar to Latin. And if you walked up to Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci, they would be thinking scientifically, they would be expressing themselves architecturally, they would be drawing or painting in manners that were deliberately emulative of Roman society. So they didn't open a treasure chest and say how to be a Roman. There had been 1,500 years of tradition. Therefore, there must have been some absorption of Roman culture rather than an abject decline. But all that said, what was life like, let's say, in 510 AD as compared to 310 AD in the Italian peninsula, for that matter, anywhere around the empire except in the East that still remained under Byzantine control? I think it would have been a frightful change. If you woke up in 510 and you had a small farm outside of Narbonne, France, that meant there was not going to be a Roman legion or a state militia to protect you from raiding, plundering, theft. There were organized gangs that had come across the once defensible borders of the empire on the Danube and the Rhine, and they had sort of a free-for-all. They could do what they wanted and what they pleased. Society was reverting from a centralized state authority that had responsibilities to protect the citizenry in the countryside to sort of a tribal piratical system where people were on their own, and we start to see the presence archaeologically of fewer farms and more fortified farms. If you were someone near Hadrian's Wall and you had a nice home that had glass in it, the glass probably was imported, you wouldn't have access to glass anymore. If you were in southern Spain and you had a sewer system that depended on clay tiles, you wouldn't have access to a clay center, perhaps. If you were constipated in Athens and you needed silphium, a drug that would allow your bowels to relax, and it comes from Cyrene, Libya, you wouldn't be able to have a ship cross the Mediterranean, go up the Rhone Valley, or go anywhere in the empire and give you silphium. And so the complex, globalized nature of Mediterranean culture broke down, and it had real consequences. It meant that people, millions of them, in the countryside, 70 to 80 million, suddenly were less safe, they were materially impoverished, and they had no recourse to civil government. If they had a dispute with a neighbor, they could not go into a Roman magistrate and adjudicate it according to Roman law with a barrister. So society in the rural areas of the Roman Empire started to unwind in the 5th century AD. And we have to ask ourselves why, because, as I said earlier, people had overcome these challenges before, and society in the East continued. To the greatest scholar of the fall of the Roman Empire, Edward Gibbon, the great 18th century British Tory, it was simple that between the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century, a Middle East renegade religion, sort of as if some sort of virus had burrowed its way into the Roman Empire, and in this 2 to 3 century period had grabbed the central nervous system of it and started cloning itself, and it had taken all of Roman society and turned it into the Roman Catholic Church. In other words, palaces, basilicas had become, and meeting halls and assembly halls had become churches. Millions of people had disconnected from the economy. In the words of the great classical scholar Geoffrey de St. Croix, there was a new parasitical class of nuns and clerics and priests, and they had vast lands that were taken out of the taxation system that had to be supported. But for Gibbon, it was even more insidious, that people woke up in the morning once Christianity became the official religion, and they said to themselves, I have a soul, and the soul will live on in heaven due to the grace of Jesus Christ, and how I live on this earth, if I'm meek, I'm tolerant, if I turn the other cheek, in other words, all of the values that are antithetical to classical civic militarism, I'll go to heaven. And therefore, if somebody's going to attack me, I'll be pacifistic. It was Gibbon's idea, in other words, that all of the classical virtues of defense, responsibility to protect yourself, honor, wealth, all of these things were challenged, and it created a meeker, more passive population that lent itself to be more vulnerable to foreign pressures than had been true of the past. Now, the problem with Gibbon's explanation, of course, is that what happened in the Byzantine East? Weren't they Christians? Why were they able to maintain their empire for 1,000 years when they had to deal with everybody from the Turks to the Persians to the Egyptians to Islam? And so one overarching explanation doesn't seem to work. Maybe land had been exhausted and agricultural production failed because of a lack of sustainable science. People were too greedy, they were exploitative, they plundered the soil, so to speak. Well, that doesn't work, because we know that the Romans had inherited from the Greeks and the Egyptians the pharaonic estates along the Nile, and they not only had taken exhausted land, but they'd made them much more fertile through the arts of everything from irrigation and drainage to fertilization with sophisticated manures. So we know the Romans were agronomists above all. There were plagues, of course, but there were plagues throughout the Roman period and throughout the Greek period. The Great Plague at Athens in 430 and 429 BC probably killed over 80,000 people, yet Athens survived. In the way that Constantinople survived plagues, and the Antonine period, Ravenna and Rome, they all survived plagues. So that doesn't quite explain. Some scientists said it was the use of lead pipes. People started to drink water through lead. Lead poisoning caused all sorts of osteo problems, and the elite became sterile. We know that the elite became sterile, but it was not probably because of lead, because lead pipes, if we look at the number of people who in Roman society were drinking out of piped-in water in lead was very small. And more important, the Romans themselves were aware of it. They knew that people who worked in the lead mines were prone to greater degrees of illness and sickness, and they cautioned about the use of lead pipes. If we wanted to look at the barbarians rather than the Romans for the cause, there have been a number of scholars who say, you know what, you guys are just Western-centric. Why do you think your survival depends on what you do? Let's look at the Visigoths and the Goths and the Vandals and the Huns and ask yourself what they were doing. And the answer might be that they were more rigorous, they were in a hardier climate, they were multiplying, and they started to drift across the Danube and the Rhine, and they had copied for over 200 years Roman military practice. They believed in themselves in a way that the Romans didn't, and they simply improved their game, so to speak, whereas before, in the 2nd and 3rd century, they were only to make limited incursions. By the 5th century AD, their incursions turned into full-scale assaults and occupations. Well, if the barbarians were getting better in military affairs, why weren't the Romans in counter-challenge fashion getting even better than they were? Why didn't they react to it? And some people have argued, well, look at the legions, the 250 to 400,000 Roman soldiers. By the 5th century AD, they were localized. They were along the Rhine and Danube. They were doing things that they had never done in the 1st century. They were marrying, they were having families, they were recruiting legionnaires from Germanic-speaking tribes. They were parochial. You could not tell a Roman legionnaire up on the Danube, what is today near Munich, you couldn't tell him, we have a crisis in Carthage, get on a boat, go across the Mediterranean, fight for a Latin-speaking Rome. He'd never been to Italy, he didn't know much about Rome, so there was a multicultural process that balkanized the Roman Empire into linguistic and ethnic enclaves who felt, you know, I really don't have an allegiance to the central complexity of the Roman Empire itself. I am a local person. I like Roman armor. I like Spanish steel. I like the gladius. I like the pilum. I like their strategy. I will use it against them and get paid, but not participate in the larger cultural paradigm of the empire itself. That's a common explanation. We know another reason from Hollywood is decadence. There was a small Roman elite, say in an empire of 70 million, 1 million people concentrated in the great cities in North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, and Rome and Athens were consumers, and they were not producers. In other words, taxation was creating capital off the countryside and bringing it into an elite. Let me paint a more logical picture of what we're talking about. And to answer the causes of Rome's fall, we have to ask why it succeeded. What made it so wealthy in the first place? Obviously, the ability to use the Mediterranean as a common nexus of transport was critical. But more importantly was the idea that individual citizens had property. They used Roman science, Roman commerce, the network of information and economic vibrancy that the Mediterranean offered. They created goods and services, and then they exchanged them in cities, and they became prosperous. So these were the people who built Rome. These were the Roman legions. They were 16-year tenures of veteran farmers, the people of Italy, the yeomen, salt of the earth of Italy, and of Greece, and of Spain. But in a process of continual warring, which created the Roman Empire between the end of the Third Punic War and the Battle of Actium in 31, what we are starting to see is that new areas are incorporated into Rome, piecemeal. Hispania, the modern Iberian Peninsula, Gaul, Pontus, Greece, the Holy Land, the Attalids, the Seleucid Empire, the Egyptian Empire. And each time that these areas are incorporated, they become Romanized eventually, they become globalized, but they create one greater challenge. In other words, the Italians are very good at making Sicilians Romans. They're very good at making Spanish tribes Roman. They're very good at French, but they have to do it with Numidians, they have to do it with Carthaginians, they have to do it with Berbers. Each time that they bring in a new group, they have to ensure that everybody is on the same page as far as language, values, politics, and culture. And finally, as this empire starts to form, that's not so easy. And more importantly is that the number of conquered territories brings in more land and more conquered people, slaves. And this has an insidious effect on Rome because you're not re-examining what the country is doing. Let me give you a modern parallel. If the United States is borrowing $1 trillion today. What if we were just to conquer Mexico? Or then we would go out and we would try to conquer Alberta and get its oil. Or we would go up to Alaska and go across the Bering Straits and take part of Siberia. Each time that we did that, we might bring in subservient people that we could exploit their labor, or we might find new natural riches. But at some point, we're not dealing with the problem that we're not being productive, that we're not looking inward and self-critiquing ourselves and asking ourselves, is our system an economically productive one that creates real goods and services, or is an exploitive one that's like some monster that has to be fed with new land and new people? And it suggests, a lot of the evidence suggests by the first century that the latter was the case. Now, what is a lot of the evidence? We have archaeological surveys of the countryside, and we're starting to see vast estates. And two things happen when you take territory that was subdivided during the Republic among small farmers who were legionnaires and participants in civic government, and you start to recombine those into one vast estate. Number one, of course, where did the farmers go? Well, they start to go to the cities. So we start to see Rome expand from 100,000 up to Greater Rome, over 1 million people. All of these cities achieved a level of magnitude, population density that was just unheard of in the Republic, and they had to be served. They were service economies, and it meant that people in the country had to supply them things, because people in the country were no longer farming. They had gone to the cities, and the people in the country were whom now? They were vast landowners. As people had left the country to fight, they had left their estates, they were promised new ones and new territories. The people behind bought them up. And where did they get the labor? Every time Rome fought a war in Numidia or Gaul, they brought in more slaves. We're told Julius Caesar himself, during his 8 years of Gallic campaigning, brought in 1 million slaves to Rome. And that meant that there were not opportunities for people to make a living as a contractor, as a day laborer, as a farmer, but one person could organize capital and labor through the use of slave labor. So you start to see the countryside depopulated in relative terms, the cities expanding, and the cities served by these agricultural regimens where a few people are on top and they're exploiting slave labor. And we see it most manifestly in the great slave uprisings that we associate with Spartacus and the slave wars in Sicily. But there are other problems with depopulation of the countryside and the changeover from agrarianism to corporate agriculture, and that is the types of crops that are being raised. We start to see in the 1st century AD insidiously and steadily a concentration in Italy, Spain, France, away from grain to grapes for wine growing, specialization of grapes, and a specialization on very uneconomic types of production. And that in the ancient world means cows, cattle, and horses. The classical Roman army were foot soldiers. They got their cavalry, the auxilia, from tribal people. In ancient Greece, it was just considered exorbitant to have a horse. How can you have 2 or 3 acres set aside that could feed 10 people just to grow pasturage or hay for a horse? So they were very rare. But we start to see horse raising as a method of ostentations, aristocratic privilege, of transportation among an elite. And more importantly, we start to see a greater frequency of meat in the diet, whether it's not just sheep and goats, but the most inefficient of all, cattle. And there's a sense that a lot of productive farmland is not being best utilized to produce the most number of people, but it's relatively sparsely inhabited, and it's run by a grandee, usually in an absentee fashion, and it's run by a bailiff with slave labor throughout the empire. This can create an economy in the sense of it's specialized and efficient, but it's starting to warp the entire situation in Rome itself in cultural and economic and political terms. Let me just elaborate on that. If you have people going into the city and they need jobs, but they're competing against ever and ever number of slaves, so they're not going to be able to create small businesses or do manual tasks when slaves are much cheaper. They don't have representation because they're not property owners. They're not going to serve in the military because they're not autonomous farmers in the classical tradition. The military will be increasingly mercenary, and as I said, staffed by frontier peoples. So what are they going to do in Rome? What are they going to do in Alexandria? What are they going to do in Miletus? Well, they're going to tend to be fed, often on the so-called annona or the dole, and they have to be entertained. We have the sense of juveniles bred in circuses. So we're starting to see an urbanized minority of the population served by a very inefficient form of agriculture. If we were to read Theophrastus about classical Greek agriculture, it discusses how you have to keep and shape yourself to do your own work, when you should cut down an oak tree to make a wheel. It's very practical, and it's aimed at the hands-on farmer himself. What is the advice in Roman agricultural literature? When you should buy a slave, when he gets too old, get rid of him, how to make sure that slaves are not cheating you, whether to whip them, when you can kill them or strangle them, what type of vineyard is the best, what type of wine is the best. All of the things that a classical Greek or classical Roman would say were inefficient. And when you have an army that's not being staffed by yeomen, it's being staffed by tribesmen and frontier people who are hardier, then what are their actual allegiances? So I think what I'm arguing is that we're right at the central crux of Western civilization. Once you create a consensual society, and once you could create a corresponding free enterprise system, you create goods and services, you create material bounty, and you create affluence. And that has to be directed to positive aims. And it can be done by small networks of farmers, rural shame cultures, religion, community, interest in the individual. All of these mechanisms, official, unofficial, and official, that tell the citizen, you are a Roman citizen, you are inheritors of a great legacy, you should get up in the morning, you should work very hard, you should be proud of your culture, you should fight for your culture, you should participate in politics. That message is being lost in a sea of affluence and a sea of leisure, at least among the elite. We're starting to see that the emperors and the legates and the prefects and the proconsuls are not Latin speaking, and we're starting to see a multicultural tribalization. I don't think Rome fell because of a scientific explanation, soil exhaustion or lead pipes or diseases. I don't think it fell because Christianity weakened the civic fiber of the citizenry. It fell because it got vast, and the reasons that allowed it to get vast, individual responsibility, small agricultural production, small farming, agrarianism, local councils, assemblies, was deemed inefficient. Once the Mediterranean became a Roman lake and people found that they had unlimited supplies of labor through slavery and conquered territories and precious metals and luxury items, and you started to have an urbanized elite, that ruling class forgot the civic virtues that had made the Republic work. Why did it survive in the East? Why did Byzantium survive? A couple of reasons, I think, and it doesn't have much to do with the idea that they were on a different track. Number one, of course, is that they had the Hellespont and the Bosphorus. And the Eastern Roman Empire had specialized in naval operations in a way that West did not. And it turned out that northern Italy was far less defensible than Constantinople and Roman culture along the coast of Asia Minor. And so they had some advantages in that aspect. Number two, on the other side of the Danube and the other side of the Rhine, we know there was a population explosion with long contact with Roman, sort of an osmosis, where people who learned about Roman society, learned how it worked, learned about the wealth, learned how to fight, and they borrowed back and forth, and they were able to create sophisticated tribal armies, so to speak, and there were lots of them. But that was not true way to the east, at least in the European East. There were Huns, of course, and there were some Goths, but there was not the same level of pressure against the East as there was in the West. Third, the Eastern Empire had been able to work out arrangements with, at first, the Persian Empire, and then later the Egyptians, and then later Islam itself, of mutual benefit through the routes from India and China that came through into the Mediterranean. And they had a system of commerce that was mutually beneficial for a lot of different people. And then four, if we look at the Byzantine Empire after its great effort to recombine East and West under the Emperor Justinian and his great general Belisarius in the 6th century BC, after that failed, so to speak, Africa, Spain was lost to Islam, Italy was lost again to the Lombards, and the West was cut off for good. If you look at Eastern Roman culture, it's not very big. 9th and 10th and 11th and 12th century. We're talking about a coastal strip and around Constantinople. And the Eastern Empire found very carefully that among a small group of people in heavily fortified towns, and the greatest fortifications in the ancient world, the greatest investment of labor and capital were the walls of Constantinople, and with access to the Mediterranean through the Hellespont and the Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara, a sophisticated mercantile people behind strong fortifications that were experts at naval warfare could survive a long time. Where does this all leave us? Is there any lessons for the present or the future? Because as I said at the beginning, we seem to be obsessed with how something so sophisticated as the Roman Empire could fall so suddenly and abjectly and could leave such impoverishment in its wake. And I think the answer is just what you might think. If you have coinage, don't print money. If you're if you're not productive, then don't act as if you're productive. And if you have a golden aureus or a sestertius and it doesn't have enough silver or doesn't have enough gold, doesn't have enough bronze, then don't put veneers on it as if it does. If you have a fertile countryside, don't let one person own it all, and don't let them divert it to unproductive uses. If you have a citizenry and it wants to be protected, you have to find a mechanism to invest them. And what's disturbing about contemporary society in some sense is that whether we're fighting in Iraq or Afghanistan, we're defended by a very small percentage of the American population. And more disturbing still, we're not engaged as a people in the conduct of our wars anymore. We pay people very well and we train them very well, but whether they get killed or they kill people on any given day abroad, where it's not as much interest as American Idol, for example. And we do seem that we have a lot of elites that are investing a lot of capital in things that we would call not productive. If Roman women suddenly discovered they could put white lead makeup and make themselves look neat by emulating the look of a barbarian Gaul, we have the equivalent in Botox. Botox doesn't do anything to create society's material wealth, productivity, advancement of knowledge. In other words, we're spending a lot of money in a society that by any definition is broke on extraneous uses that are not productive, consumption rather than production. A society, in other words, like Rome, reaches a critical mass, and so does the United States, when its emphasis is not on production. It's on consumption and under redistribution. So the best question to ask about Rome, why did it fall? I would say, how did it last so long? How did a society by the 1st century AD that no longer could plunder, it had run out of new territory, it had started to reach the maximum number of new peoples it could enslave. When it reached those limits and it was not creating wealth, then it just became a question of how much would last to redistribute and consume, since there was not any commensurate production. It's a lesson we should learn today in the United States, because it seems that our national gospel is consumption and redistribution without emphasis on creating new wealth. When a society has a peasant mentality and it gets to the point where it doesn't believe that it can grow, but it's just finite, and the slices have to be resliced and redistributed, then the pie itself is not sufficient and society erodes, whether it's Americans or Romans.